You know you've crossed an invisible threshold in your inner development when you stop needing anyone to validate what you've been through. It's not that the pain disappears. Pain rarely behaves so conveniently. It's that you no longer outsource the legitimacy of your suffering to the opinions of other people. This marks a profound psychological shift, because as long as you're waiting for someone to acknowledge your wounds, you remain tied to the very environment that injured you in the first place. But once you stop explaining yourself, something remarkable happens. You begin reclaiming your emotional sovereignty. For many people, the instinct to justify their pain becomes almost reflexive. They want others to understand the complexity of what happened, how deeply it cut, how long it lasted, how unfair it was. And at first, that desire seems reasonable. We're social beings. We use language to bridge the gap between our inner world and the outer one. But when you've passed your soul's most painful test, you realize that certain experiences can't be adequately translated into words anyway. They're too large, too intimate, too interwoven with the fabric of who you've become. And so you stop trying to make people see what they were never capable of seeing. You stop demanding empathy from those who haven't earned access to your inner reality. This shift is not coldness, it's clarity. It's an understanding that the value of your struggle isn't determined by how many people believe you. It's defined by the transformation it produced. And the moment you internalize that, you become less socially reactive and more internally anchored. You stop arguing with people who dismiss your pain. You stop defending your story to those who reduce or distort it. You stop trying to convince anyone that you were hurt. You simply know that you were, and that knowledge is enough. There's also something psychological happening here that is worth pointing out. When you no longer rely on external validation, your nervous system stops operating in survival mode. You are no longer scanning for approval or fearfully monitoring whether others interpret your experience correctly. You stop living in that exhausting feedback loop of seeking permission to feel what you feel. And when that loop dissolves, emotional maturity takes its place. You begin trusting your own interpretation of events. You begin believing your own instincts. You begin valuing your inner voice over the noise of the crowd. Human beings become significantly harder to manipulate when they trust their own perception. In this sense, your pain becomes a teacher that no longer needs an audience. The suffering you endured has already carved its lesson into you, and the way you hold yourself now, the steadiness, the insight, the refusal to be pulled back into old dynamics, becomes the proof. You carry your experience not as a wound that needs to be shown, but as a truth that quietly shapes the way you move through the world. This is one of the clearest signs that you've passed a soul-level test. You no longer need the world to witness your suffering because you have already witnessed it yourself. And that self-witnessing is what grants you the strength to move forward. You rise the moment you stop needing permission to rise. One of the clearest signs that you've crossed a major psychological threshold is the shift from reacting impulsively to responding deliberately. It may sound subtle, even almost semantic, but the difference is enormous. A reaction is immediate. It's driven by old wounds, unconscious fears, and the emotional residue you haven't yet sorted through. A response, on the other hand, emerges from awareness. It's slower, intentional, and rooted in a sense of inner stability. When you begin to respond instead of react, it means your pain no longer controls the steering wheel. You do. Most people underestimate how much their reactions are shaped by unresolved experiences. A harsh tone from someone can trigger the echo of an older conflict. a moment of being ignored, can ignite a childhood fear of invisibility. Someone withdrawing love can unconsciously awaken the memory of abandonment. And when you haven't passed through the deeper layers of your pain, you're basically living at the mercy of those invisible patterns. You're not responding to what's happening now. You're responding to everything that happened before. But when you've endured your soul's most painful test and actually integrated the lesson, your internal landscape changes. You start noticing the space between stimulus and action. That space is where freedom begins. Instead of instantly lashing out, collapsing, running, or clinging, you pause, sometimes only for seconds. Yet those seconds make all the difference. They allow you to assess the situation instead of drowning in it. They allow you to observe your emotional surge without letting it hijack your behavior. They allow you to choose a path rather than follow a script. That pause is a sign of strengthened psychological structure. It tells you that your nervous system has become more regulated, your emotional boundaries clearer, and your sense of self more defined. You're no longer living in reaction to life, you're engaging with it consciously. And this shift doesn't mean you become passive or emotionless. Quite the opposite. You feel everything, but the feeling no longer overwhelms your ability to act wisely. It is a discipline born from suffering. When you've faced enough pain, you eventually learn that impulsive reactions only deepen the chaos. You begin to see that clarity emerges not from emotional storms, but from the calm you cultivate in their aftermath. Your reactions once served as a defense mechanism. Your responses now serve as an instrument of sovereignty. This transformation also changes how you relate to people. You stop escalating conflict unnecessarily. You stop personalizing everything. You stop assuming the worst intentions. A grounded response gives you the ability to navigate complexity without losing yourself. And the people who once provoked your deepest wounds lose their power over you. Not because they've changed, but because you have. To respond instead of react is to reclaim authorship over your own life. It is the moment the test stops defining you and starts refining you. Choose the pause. In that space, your new self is born. There comes a moment in your healing when the very things that used to destabilize you begin to reveal their meaning. And it's almost strange, because at first you don't even notice the shift. You encounter the same trigger, the same memory, the same kind of person who once sent you spiraling, and instead of collapsing into the old emotional pattern, you find yourself observing it with a new kind of intelligence. You're not consumed by it, you're studying it. This is one of the great paradoxes of psychological growth. What once felt like a threat eventually becomes a teacher, and that transformation signals that something deep within you has reorganized. Most people assume the test is over when the pain stops, but that's rarely how it works. The real indication that you've passed a soul-level initiation is that you can face the same stimulus as before without being pulled under. You can finally see the architecture of the lesson behind the discomfort. That's when you know the wound is integrating into wisdom instead of just bleeding beneath your awareness. Triggers, when you haven't processed your pain, feel like attacks. They hit the nervous system with a force that seems disproportionate to the moment. But when integration occurs, that force softens. You start noticing where the reaction comes from, what history it belongs to, what insecurity it lights up, what old version of you it once controlled. And because you can see all of that, the trigger loses its power. Awareness breaks the spell. This shift also requires a kind of radical honesty. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" a question rooted in helplessness, you begin to ask, What is this showing me about myself? That question is uncomfortable because it asks you to stop blaming situations and start examining your own patterns. Yet it is precisely this discomfort that produces growth. When the pain becomes a mirror instead of a prison, you have stepped into a higher level of psychological maturity. You also stop making your healing the responsibility of other people. You stop expecting them to behave differently so you can feel safe. You understand that the world isn't going to rearrange itself around your wounds, but you can rearrange your inner world so that the same external events no longer shatter you. This is the essence of emotional autonomy, realizing you can't control the trigger, but you can absolutely master your response to it, and that mastery doesn't arise from denial or suppression. It comes from knowing yourself deeply, your patterns, your fears, your core vulnerabilities, and taking responsibility for them. The trigger then becomes an invitation to strengthen your internal structure, not an invitation to collapse. Once you reach this stage, life stops feeling like a series of random attacks. It starts to feel like a conversation, one where every challenge has something to teach you about who you are becoming. And the moment you recognize the lesson inside the trigger, you reclaim your authority over your own transformation. See the pattern, learn from it, rise beyond the version of yourself that once reacted to it. You know you've crossed an important psychological threshold when you can sit with your grief without collapsing under its weight. This is one of the most misunderstood markers of emotional evolution. People often assume that healing means the disappearance of pain, as if the goal were to become untouchable, invulnerable, impermeable. But that's not how human beings work. Pain doesn't disappear, it integrates. And when it integrates, you gain the ability to feel deeply without being destroyed by what you feel. That is strength, real strength, not the brittle form of denial, but the grounded stability of someone who has walked through their own darkness and learned how to stand upright inside it. Grief used to overwhelm you because you didn't have the internal structures to hold it. You didn't have the boundaries, the emotional vocabulary, or the self-trust to process what was happening within you. So the pain felt like too much, too sharp, too relentless, too heavy, and in that state, collapse seems almost inevitable. But passing your soul's most painful test means you've developed new internal architecture, something sturdier, something conscious, something capable of containing intensity without breaking. You start noticing the shift in subtle ways. You feel sadness rise, but it doesn't spiral into despair. You feel loss, but it doesn't drag you backward into old wounds. You feel disappointment, but it doesn't trigger the belief that you are unworthy or unlovable. The emotional experience is still there, still real, still human, but no longer catastrophic. You're not drowning, you're navigating. Part of what makes this possible is the maturity to allow emotion without trying to escape it. You stop running from your sorrow. You stop numbing it, denying it, minimizing it, or projecting it onto the people around you. Instead, you face it directly. You let it move through you rather than letting it define you. That's a sign of a deeply reorganized psyche. Pain becomes something you experience, not something you are held hostage by. This ability also reveals an understanding that grief isn't the enemy, it's information. It tells you what mattered, what was lost, what needs attention, what needs closure. When you can feel grief without being consumed, you're no longer at war with your own emotional reality. You're cooperating with it. You're allowing it to shape you instead of shatter you. And the truth is, this emotional endurance is not born from comfort. It is forged in the very moments when you thought you wouldn't survive. It emerges from the nights you spent wrestling with thoughts you couldn't speak, from the days you carried pain no one saw, from the experiences that forced you to grow in ways you didn't feel ready for. That kind of strength doesn't come cheaply. It's earned through fire. But once you have it, it becomes a permanent part of you. It becomes the quiet confidence that tells you, even in moments of sorrow, I can handle this. I won't collapse. I won't break. And that confidence, rooted not in arrogance but in lived experience, is one of the most unmistakable signs that you've passed through something profound. Because the person who can grieve without losing themselves is the person who has finally learned how to live. Hold your sorrow with strength, and it will reveal who you are becoming. One of the surest signs that you've passed a soul level test is the clarity and firmness of your boundaries. And it's interesting, because this usually emerges quietly, almost invisibly at first. You're not announcing anything. You're not trying to prove a point. You're simply no longer willing to participate in the patterns that once drained you. That shift doesn't come from anger. It comes from understanding. You've lived through the consequences of having porous boundaries, and you know exactly what it costs. So when your boundaries strengthen, it isn't about becoming harder. It's about becoming more aligned with the truth of who you are. Most people misunderstand boundaries. They think of them as rigid walls or acts of defiance or some kind of aggressive self-protection. But real boundaries are actually rooted in self-respect. They're the natural expression of knowing your worth, knowing your limits, and knowing what your soul simply cannot tolerate anymore. When you've endured deep emotional pain, you become intimately aware of where you abandon yourself, where you say yes when everything inside you is screaming no, where you shrink to avoid conflict, where you accept behavior that chips away at your dignity, and eventually that becomes unbearable. Passing the painful test means you finally refuse to make yourself small to keep the peace. You begin to understand that preserving your inner integrity is more important than avoiding someone else's disappointment. Your no becomes direct and unburdened by guilt. Your yes becomes intentional instead of automatic. And the people who once relied on your lack of boundaries, consciously or unconsciously, are no longer able to navigate you the same way. That often reveals who was relating to your authentic self and who was relating only to your compliance. The interesting thing is that firm boundaries rarely arise from a place of empowerment at first. They arise from exhaustion, from the realization that betraying yourself is too high a price to pay. You learn slowly and sometimes painfully that protecting your well-being is not selfish, it is necessary. Without boundaries, you cannot heal. Without boundaries, you cannot grow. Without boundaries, you cannot become the version of yourself your soul is pushing you toward. Once this shift happens, you start making different choices. You walk away sooner. You speak up sooner. You distance yourself from people who drain your energy. You stop justifying the behavior of those who repeatedly show you who they are. You stop giving unlimited access to individuals who have done nothing to earn it. And all of this happens not because you've become cold, but because you've become conscious. A boundary is ultimately a declaration of identity. It is the line that separates what strengthens you from what harms you. And once you've passed your soul's most painful test, you no longer allow the world to cross that line at will. You protect what you've earned. You protect who you've become. Because after everything you've survived, you know one thing with absolute certainty. Your peace is too expensive to sacrifice ever again. There's a moment, quiet, almost imperceptible, when you realize that something inside you has settled. It's not the dramatic breakthrough you might expect. It's not euphoria, not triumph, not the emotional high people often imagine healing to be. It's a grounded calm, a kind of inner stillness that wasn't available to you before. And the remarkable thing is that nothing external needs to change for you to feel it. The world is still chaotic. The past is still the past. People are still behaving in ways you cannot control. Yet there is a steadiness within you that wasn't there before. That is the unmistakable sign that you've passed your soul's most painful test. This inner peace doesn't come from avoidance. It doesn't come from cutting your emotions off. It certainly doesn't come from pretending nothing hurt you. It comes from integration, from the long, difficult process of facing your suffering honestly, understanding what it revealed, and reorganizing your inner world around the truths you learned. The peace you feel is not the absence of struggle, it is the presence of a stronger, more coherent self. You start noticing that the things which once consumed your mind no longer hold you hostage. The past stops ambushing you with the same intensity. You're not replaying conversations, rehearsing defenses, analyzing hidden meanings, or anticipating harm. Your mind becomes quieter because it no longer needs to scan for danger in the places where the danger has already passed. The nervous system, once tense and hypervigilant, finally begins to relax. And that relaxation creates a psychological spaciousness, a sense that you can breathe in your own life again. This peace also comes from an acceptance of reality, not in a passive way, but in an empowered way. You understand that certain things happened, and they cannot unhappen. Certain people were who they were, not who you needed them to be. Certain endings were painful but necessary, and rather than resisting this truth or fighting against it, you begin to cooperate with it. Acceptance becomes a form of wisdom. It allows you to stop wrestling with what you cannot change and start investing in what you can. Another part of this inner peace is the surprising lack of resentment. When you've truly integrated your pain, bitterness loses its fuel. It's not that you forget what happened, it's that the emotional charge is gone. You understand that carrying hatred is too heavy, too consuming, too corrosive to your own spirit. In letting go of resentment, you're not excusing the past, you're simply refusing to be owned by it, and that peace becomes a kind of compass. It doesn't demand attention, but it guides the way you move through the world. It influences your decisions, your relationships, your priorities. You start choosing environments that reflect the stability you feel internally. You start walking away from what disturbs that stability. It becomes easier, almost instinctive, to protect the calm you fought so hard to earn. This quiet inner peace is the final sign, because it cannot be faked. You cannot intellectualize your way into it. You can only arrive here by surviving what once felt unsurvivable. And when you reach that place, you know, without needing anyone to confirm it, that the worst is behind you and the best is now possible. Protect this peace. It's the doorway to the life your pain was preparing you to live.